the Villisca axe murders, the night an entire family was erased. On the night of June 9, 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa, went to sleep as it always had. The streets were unpaved, the air carried the scent of livestock and summer grass. Front doors were often left unlocked. Neighbors knew one another by name. Nothing about that Sunday evening suggested it would become one of the most haunting nights in American criminal history. Josiah Moore, a respected businessman, had spent the evening attending Children's Day exercises at the Presbyterian Church with his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children. The event had ended around 9:30 p.m. It had been cheerful. Children singing, community gathering, lantern light flickering softly. 2 sisters, Ina and Lena Stillinger, had been invited to spend the night at the Moore home after the church event. It was common in a town like Villisca. Parents trusted neighbors. Children moved freely between homes. Around 10 p.m., the Moore family and their guests returned to the modest white house on East 2nd Street. The house was narrow, 2 stories, a small attic above, bedrooms arranged tightly along the upper level. That night, 8 people slept inside. By morning, all 8 would be dead. Sometime after midnight, while the town was silent and dark, someone entered the Moore home. There were no signs of forced entry. Investigators later believed the killer may have hidden inside the house before the family returned from church. Or he may have entered quietly after they had gone to sleep. What is certain is this: the killer carried an axe. The weapon was later identified as belonging to Josiah Moore himself, kept in the shed behind the house. That detail has always lingered. The murderer did not bring his own weapon. He used what was already there. The first victims were Josiah and Sarah Moore. They slept in a bedroom on the 2nd floor. The killer struck Josiah first. The blows were severe and repeated, more than necessary to ensure death. Then Sarah. Each victim was attacked in their beds. No evidence suggested prolonged struggle. The attacks were sudden, brutal, efficient. From there, the killer moved to the children's rooms. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul Moore, each struck with the blunt and sharp edge of the axe. The 2 sisters were killed in the guest room. Ina, 8 years old, Lena, 12. Lena may have partially awakened. Some evidence suggested defensive wounds on her arm. But in the darkness, against an adult attacker wielding an axe, there was little chance of survival. What makes the Villisca murders uniquely unsettling is not only the violence, it is what happened after. The killer remained inside the house for some time. He covered mirrors with clothing. He draped sheets over the victims' faces. He washed his hands in a bowl in the kitchen. He left slabs of bacon on the stove. He ate food from the Moore pantry. And then, sometime before dawn, he vanished. The next morning, neighbors noticed something unusual. The Moore family had not begun their day. By 8 a.m., this was strange. By 9 a.m., it was alarming. Mary Peckham, a neighbor, knocked on the door. There was no answer. She tried again. Still silence. Eventually, Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, was called. He unlocked the door and entered the house. He climbed the stairs. What he saw has been described in reports as almost unrecognizable. The bodies were discovered in their beds, blood soaked through mattresses, walls splattered, sheets pulled tightly over faces. The house quickly filled with townspeople. Before law enforcement could secure the scene, dozens had walked through it. Neighbors moved through rooms, touched objects, stared. The sheriff, Hank Horton, arrived amidst the crowd, but rural law enforcement in 1912 had limited forensic tools. No DNA analysis, no fingerprint database of value, No crime scene containment protocol as we understand today. The axe was found in the guest room, leaning against a wall. It had been wiped partially clean. Bloody fingerprints may have been present, but there was no effective method to preserve them conclusively. Footprints were observed outside near the house. Some believed they led toward the railroad tracks, but by midday, so many curious townspeople had gathered that any tracks were indistinguishable. The news spread rapidly beyond Villisca. 8 people killed in a single household, bludgeoned with an axe. No robbery, no clear motive. It captured national headlines. Because this was not a city crime, not gang violence, not a drunken dispute. It was a quiet Midwestern home and a killer who entered silently. Investigators began looking for suspects almost immediately. Suspicion fell first on transient men traveling by train, railroad workers, drifters. Villisca sat along a rail line. It was possible someone had arrived unnoticed, left unnoticed. Then suspicion turned inward. Josiah Moore had business rivals. He had once worked for a man named Frank Jones. There were rumors of tension between them. Some townspeople believed the murders were personal, targeted. Yet the brutality extended beyond Josiah. It included children, guests. The violence seemed excessive for a simple business dispute. As days passed, theories multiplied. Was it revenge, jealousy, mental illness, or something darker? One theory emerged that the killer had waited in the attic, listening, watching, descending only after the house was fully asleep. The attic showed signs of disturbance. A plate of food was found there, a cigarette butt, indicating someone may have hidden above. If true, it meant the killer was inside the house before the family returned from church, waiting, listening to their footsteps, hearing their evening conversations. The thought of that possibility has haunted the case for over a century because it changes the timeline from intrusion to infiltration, and infiltration suggests planning. The Villisca axe murders would become one of the most infamous unsolved mass murders in American history. But on that June morning in 1912, it was simply horror. A house that had been filled with children's laughter the night before now held 8 lifeless bodies. Lantern light replaced by daylight, exposing violence in full clarity. The killer was gone. No witnesses, no arrest, just silence. By noon on June 10, 1912, the house on East 2nd Street was no longer quiet. It was crowded. Farmers who had heard the news left their fields and gathered near the property. Women wept openly on the sidewalk. Children were pulled indoors by frightened parents. Reporters began arriving from nearby towns by late afternoon. The sheriff attempted to maintain order, but in a town of barely 2,000 residents, shock overrode procedure. People entered the Moore home before law enforcement had fully documented the scene. Some walked upstairs, some touched furniture, some lifted sheets. Evidence that might have mattered was trampled. It would later be said that more than 100 people passed through the house before it was secured. In modern terms, the crime scene was contaminated beyond repair. Still, investigators worked with what they could. The axe was examined more carefully. It had belonged to Josiah Moore. The shed behind the Moore house suggested the killer likely retrieved it from the family's shed. That detail suggested familiarity with the property, or at least a willingness to explore it before entering the house. There were no signs of robbery. Money remained in Josiah's wallet. Valuables were untouched. The house had not been ransacked. This was not theft. This was something else. The positioning of the bodies raised further questions. The killer had struck victims primarily with the blunt end of the axe first, knocking them unconscious before using the blade. That detail indicated method rather than frenzy. It suggested control. After each killing, sheets were pulled over faces. Mirrors throughout the house were covered. Even a hanging mirror in the parlor was draped. Investigators could not determine why. Some speculated superstition, others believed it was a way to avoid seeing reflections, perhaps even his own. The covered mirrors became one of the case's most unsettling details. They suggested the killer lingered after the murders, that he moved through the house deliberately, that he was not rushed. In the kitchen, a bowl of bloody water sat on a washstand. A towel nearby showed signs of use. The bacon left on the stove appeared partially cooked. Some investigators believed the killer had prepared food but abandoned it. Others believed he had eaten quietly before leaving. That detail, eating inside the home after committing multiple murders, disturbed even seasoned observers because it implied composure, a lack of urgency, a comfort inside a house filled with bodies. The first suspect who drew serious attention was a traveling minister named George Kelly. He had passed through Villisca days before the murders. He was known to be erratic. He had been seen peering into windows. He left town shortly after the killings. His behavior raised suspicion. Kelly was arrested months later. Under intense interrogation, he eventually confessed, but the confession was inconsistent. He claimed to have committed the murders in a daze. He described details that did not match the crime scene precisely. Some believed he had been coerced. Others believed he was mentally unstable and confessing falsely. At trial, his confession unraveled under scrutiny. There was no physical evidence placing him inside the Moore home. He was acquitted. The case returned to uncertainty. Meanwhile, attention shifted to Frank Jones, Josiah Moore's former employer. Jones was wealthy, influential, powerful within the community. Rumors suggested personal animosity between the two men. Some whispered about jealousy, others about business betrayal. There were allegations, never proven, that Jones had connections to hired killers, but no direct evidence tied him to the crime. The small-town environment amplified speculation. In Villisca, everyone knew everyone. Grudges were remembered, arguments were replayed. Over time, more than a dozen suspects were proposed: railroad workers, traveling salesmen, transient laborers. Some investigators theorized that the killer may have been a serial murderer traveling by train. Similar axe murders had occurred in other Midwestern towns around that period. Entire families killed in their beds. No robbery, no witnesses, axes found at the scene. The theory suggested a drifter moving along rail lines, selecting homes at random, entering after midnight, killing silently, and leaving before dawn. But forensic science in 1912 could not conclusively link those crimes. They remained parallel suspicions rather than proven connections. The Villisca murders lingered without resolution. Years passed. The Moore home remained standing. Visitors came to stare. The crime embedded itself into local folklore, but beneath folklore lay enduring questions. Why kill all 8 occupants? If Josiah Moore had been the primary target, why murder the children? Why kill the Stillinger sisters, guests who were not permanent members of the household? The scope of violence suggests either deep personal rage or total detachment. There was no sign of sexual assault conclusively documented, no ransom note, no political message, just execution. The methodical nature of the killings, room by room, suggests planning. The possibility that the killer hid in the attic before the family returned home adds another layer. If he waited there, he listened to them prepare for bed. He heard their evening routines. He knew exactly where they slept. He descended only after silence settled. The attic floor showed indentations, suggesting someone had lain there. A key ring belonging to Josiah Moore was found there as well. It had been removed from his pocket. Why place it there? Was it dropped accidentally? Was it symbolic? The absence of clear answers has allowed the Villisca axe murders to persist in American memory for over a century. not because of courtroom drama, but because of unresolved intrusion. A killer inside a home, in darkness, without alarm, without capture. Late at night, when this story unfolds slowly, the house feels alive again. Creaking wooden floors, wind through thin window panes, 8 people sleeping under summer air, and somewhere inside, perhaps above them in the attic, someone waiting for the final lamp to go out, waiting for breathing to slow, waiting for silence, then descending. As weeks turned into months after the murders in Villisca, something more unsettling than violence settled over the town. It was uncertainty, the kind that does not fade. Because when a crime has no clear perpetrator, the fear does not attach to one person, it attaches to everyone. Neighbors looked at one another differently. Men who had once shared tools now wondered about alibis. Families locked doors at night, something that had rarely been necessary before. The killer had not broken in, he had not smashed a window, he had entered quietly and left quietly. That detail meant he could do it again. Investigators began examining similarities between the Villisca murders and other axe killings that had occurred between 1911 and 1912 across several Midwestern states. In Colorado Springs, in Kansas, in Louisiana, in Illinois, entire families killed in their beds, axes found inside the homes, mirrors sometimes covered, doors locked from within. No robbery. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Some historians later proposed that Villisca may have been part of a larger series committed by a traveling killer moving along railroad lines. Railroads were the highways of that era. A man could arrive at dusk and leave before sunrise without leaving much trace. He could study neighborhoods, observe routines, select a house that appeared vulnerable. The Moore home sat near the rail line, close enough for someone to enter town unnoticed and depart before dawn. He struck primarily from above, often aiming for the head, the blunt side first, to avoid blood spray too early, then the blade. This was not random flailing, it was technique. The Reverend George Kelly case became a cautionary example. Another unsettling detail was the positioning of Lena Stillinger. She was found partially uncovered, unlike the other victims whose faces were covered. Some investigators speculated that the killer may have hesitated. The killer's decision to cover mirrors continues to fascinate criminologists. Was it superstition, a belief in spirits, or the idea that souls remain near mirrors after death? Or was it practical, to prevent accidental reflection of himself in low light? The covering of mirrors required time. The bacon on the stove, the plate in the attic, the bowl of bloody water. These small domestic details amplify the horror, because they suggest the killer felt no urgency. He may have eaten inside the house after killing 8 people. He may have rested, listened, ensured silence before leaving. When dawn approached, he likely walked out the same way he entered. The front door was locked from inside when discovered, the back door too. Years later, the Moore house became an object of fascination. Stories of unexplained sounds emerged, footsteps, doors closing. The Villisca axe murders endure not because of courtroom drama, they endure because of absence. No identified killer, no motive confirmed, no closure. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the fear is not loud, it is subtle. It is the idea that someone could enter a wooden house while everyone sleeps, stand over a bed, lift an axe, and leave before sunrise. No fingerprints preserved, no photographs in newspapers capturing the suspect, just memory and speculation. In the end, Villisca became more than a crime. It became a symbol of vulnerability, of how safety can be illusion, of how a town can carry a question for over a century without answer. In the years after the murders, life in Villisca continued, but it never felt the same. And the Stillinger sisters had only come over for a sleepover. That detail may be the most haunting. Which means the killer either didn't care who was inside, or he didn't know. Imagine the stillness of an attic on a summer night in 1912, waiting until breathing deepens, waiting until the last whisper fades, then descending. It feels like infiltration. For modern listeners, the Villisca axe murders feel almost cinematic. A family went to sleep, a killer entered, 8 lives ended. No one heard enough to stop it. No one saw enough to identify him, and he was never caught. Late at night, when this story settles, the Villisca axe murders remain officially unsolved. A guest room with 2 sisters, an axe leaning against a wall, and morning light revealing what darkness concealed. Entire household erased, no witness, no capture, only memory and silence. Thank you for listening.
The Chris Watts Confession, a family destroyed in silence. In the early morning hours of August 13, 2018, a security camera captured a man backing his truck into his driveway in Frederick, Colorado. It was still dark. The neighborhood was quiet. The truck belonged to Chris Watts. He worked for an oil and gas company. He wore a plain t-shirt and moved with deliberate calm. Over the next several minutes, he walked back and forth between his garage and the truck bed. He appeared to load something inside. Nothing about the footage was dramatic. No raised voices, no visible struggle. Just routine movement in the early hours before sunrise. By mid-morning, the house would be surrounded by police. And by nightfall, the story would be national news. Because inside that house had lived a family of 4. Chris, his pregnant wife Shanann, and their 2 daughters. By the end of that day, all 3 would be missing. And within 48 hours, the man seen calmly loading his truck would be confessing to killing them. But that is not how the story began. At 1:48 a.m. on August 13th, Shanann Watts arrived home from the business trip. A friend dropped her off. Doorbell camera footage showed her entering the house alone. She was 15 weeks pregnant. Her flight had been delayed. She looked tired. The friend who drove her home would later become one of the most important witnesses in the first hours of the investigation. Because by late morning, Shanann would not respond to texts. She would miss a scheduled doctor's appointment, and something would feel wrong. At 12:10 p.m., that friend called police for a welfare check. Officers arrived at the Watts home and rang the doorbell. No answer. Chris Watts returned home shortly afterward. He spoke calmly to the officers. He said Shanann had told him she was going to a friend's house with the children. He said he had been at work since early morning. His tone was measured, concerned, but controlled. When police entered the house, there were immediate inconsistencies. Shanann's phone was inside. Her purse was inside. Her car was in the garage. Her medications were untouched. If she had left voluntarily, she had done so without essentials. The beds were stripped. The house felt incomplete. Chris continued explaining that the marriage had been strained. He said they had argued that morning. He said he had told her he wanted a separation. He suggested she might have left emotionally upset. But as officers searched the home, they noted small details. The sheets from the master bed were missing. The girls' bedrooms were quiet and orderly. There were no signs of forced entry. No sign of a struggle. Just absence. A neighbor provided access to security footage from across the street. That footage showed Chris backing his work truck into the driveway at approximately 5:17 a.m. He told officers he had loaded tools into the truck before leaving for work. The video showed him walking back and forth several times. The movements were brief, controlled. Police asked him to watch the footage. He stood with his hands on his head as the screen replayed his own actions. His body language shifted slightly. Subtle. He rocked on his feet. He avoided eye contact. Still, there was no direct evidence in that moment of violence. The investigation escalated quickly. By evening, local news crews had arrived. Chris gave interviews on his front porch. He appealed directly to Shanann. He asked her to come home. He said the girls needed her. His voice did not break. His expression remained steady. Viewers across the country began forming opinions within hours. But investigators moved methodically. Phone records were pulled, text messages reviewed, work logs examined. Chris had left home around 5:30 a.m. He drove to a remote oil site owned by his employer. It was not a typical stop for him that day. He had requested to check that specific location alone. The site contained large oil storage tanks and open land. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered another element. Chris Watts was having an affair. He had been involved with a coworker for several weeks. He had told her he was separated, that his divorce was nearly finalized, that he did not have children living at home. The double life had been carefully constructed. Financial records showed strain. The family had previously filed for bankruptcy. Medical bills were mounting. A third child was on the way. Messages between Chris and his girlfriend revealed discussions about starting fresh, about a different future. None of this proved murder, but it began shaping motive. On August 14th, the day after the disappearance, investigators brought Chris in for a polygraph examination. He agreed voluntarily. He maintained that he had not harmed his family. He stated clearly that he did not know where they were. The polygraph examiner asked direct questions. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Did you physically cause your daughter's disappearance? He answered no. After the test, the examiner told him he had failed. The conversation that followed would change the trajectory of the case. Detectives confronted him. They suggested that perhaps something had happened during an argument, that maybe Shanann had hurt the girls, that maybe he reacted emotionally. The strategy was intentional. Offer a partial explanation. Create an opening. Hours into the interrogation, Chris altered his story. He said that he and Shanann had argued that morning. He said he told her he wanted a separation. He claimed she became emotional. He said he later saw her harming one of the children, and that he reacted. That he killed Shanann in anger after seeing that. This version was inconsistent with physical evidence, but it was a crack, and investigators widened it. Shortly after midnight on August 15th, Chris Watts confessed to killing his wife. He provided directions to the oil site. He told detectives where to search. The following day, law enforcement located Shanann's body in a shallow grave near the storage tanks. The bodies of Bella and Celeste were recovered from inside the oil tanks. The case shifted instantly from missing persons to triple homicide. The nation that had watched his porch interview now watched footage of his arrest. He was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased body. What remained unclear in that moment was sequence. What happened inside the house between 1:48 a.m. and 5:17 a.m.? What was said? What was decided? What was premeditated? Because the first confession was not the full story. and it would not be the last version he told. By the time Chris Watts altered his story inside the interrogation room, investigators already sensed that the version he offered was incomplete. The polygraph examiner had confronted him calmly. She did not accuse, she did not raise her voice. She simply told him that his body had reacted strongly to questions about harming his family. When he asked if he had passed, she told him no. That moment changed his posture. Until then, he had maintained steady eye contact. He had sat upright. Afterward, he leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His speech slowed. Detectives employed a technique familiar in high-stakes interrogations. They suggested a lesser narrative, an emotional reaction, a moment of loss of control. They introduced the idea that perhaps Shanann had harmed the children, that perhaps he had walked in on something unthinkable. The implication was clear. If something tragic happened spontaneously, if he reacted in shock or rage, it would not carry the same weight as calculated murder. For several minutes, Chris remained silent. Then he nodded. He began describing a version of events that shifted blame away from himself as primary aggressor. He claimed that after a heated argument about separation, he told Shanann the marriage was over. He said she became upset. He said he later saw her on a baby monitor. He claimed she was smothering one of the girls. He described reacting without thinking, strangling her. He suggested that everything spiraled from there. Investigators listened. But inconsistencies emerged quickly. The autopsies would later show that both children died by smothering, not strangulation. Shanann's cause of death was manual strangulation. The physical evidence did not support a reactive killing in defense of the children. It suggested sequence, control, compression. Pressure applied deliberately. After this partial confession, detectives asked him directly where the bodies were. He provided directions to the oil site known as Survey 319. He described burying Shanann in a shallow grave. He admitted placing the girls inside separate oil storage tanks. The logistics of that act raised further questions. Each tank opening measured only 8 inches in diameter. The girls had been forced through those openings. This detail alone suggested calculation rather than panic. On August 16th, investigators executed a search warrant at the site. They located Shanann's grave within hours. The soil had been disturbed recently. Her body was wrapped in a fitted sheet consistent with the missing bedding from the master bedroom. The children's remains were recovered from the tanks later that day. The recovery process required specialized equipment. The oil mixture had partially preserved and damaged evidence simultaneously. Forensic teams worked methodically. Back at the house, investigators reconstructed the early morning hours. Shanann's phone data showed no activity after approximately 2 a.m. Security footage from the neighbor's camera showed Chris loading his truck between 5:17 and 5:27 a.m. In that footage, there was no visible sign of Shanann or the children walking voluntarily to the vehicle. His movements were deliberate. He walked to the driver's side, to the rear, to the passenger's side. At one point, he appeared to bend down briefly. Investigators believed he had placed the children inside the truck cab. Phone records revealed that after leaving the house, he drove directly to the oil site. There were no detours, no unexpected stops. GPS data from the work truck confirmed the route and arrival time. The distance between the Watts home in Frederick and Survey 319 was approximately 45 miles. During that drive, investigators later theorized, the children were still alive. This conclusion emerged from Chris's later prison confession. Because the initial interrogation story did not last long. Within weeks of his arrest and after formal charges were filed, Chris Watts entered a guilty plea. He avoided a trial. He admitted to murdering Shanann and both daughters. He admitted that the first story he gave detectives, that Shanann had harmed the children, was false. In a detailed prison interview conducted months later, he provided a more complete timeline. According to that version, after Shanann returned home at 1:48 a.m., they argued about finances and the affair. He told her the relationship was over. She asked if he was seeing someone else. He denied it. He claimed that at some point during the argument, he climbed on top of her in bed and strangled her. He said she did not fight, that she simply looked at him as it happened. Afterward, he said he wrapped her body in a sheet. He claimed that one of the daughters, Bella, walked in and asked what was wrong with her mother. He said he told her that Shanann was sick. He then placed Shanann's body in the back of his truck. He said he put both girls in the cab with him. He drove them to the oil site alive. At the site, he said he smothered Celeste first, then Bella. He described Bella's final words as questioning. He said she asked if the same thing that happened to her sister was going to happen to her. The description was clinical, detached, as if recounting routine actions rather than irreversible acts. This later confession eliminated ambiguity. It contradicted the earlier defensive narrative entirely. It established premeditation. It established sequence. It established awareness. Back in Colorado, prosecutors prepared for trial before the guilty plea was entered. They assembled evidence not only of the murders, but of motive. Financial documents showed mounting debt, credit cards near limit, mortgage pressure. Text messages between Chris and his girlfriend revealed discussions about future plans. He had searched online for apartments. He had told her he was nearly divorced. The timeline between the affair's escalation and the murders was tight. Only weeks. Investigators also examined internet searches conducted from his phone. Terms related to divorce costs, wedding songs with his girlfriend, vacation planning. A double life unfolding quietly. The Watts home, once depicted as stable suburban normalcy on social media, revealed financial and relational strain behind closed doors. Shanann had documented family life extensively online. Photos, videos, live streams. From the outside, the family appeared close, structured, but private messages later introduced at sentencing revealed tension. Shanann expressing frustration about Chris's emotional distance, Chris responding with brevity. Reduced affection. Silence. The plea agreement removed the possibility of a televised trial, but it did not remove scrutiny. The sentencing hearing allowed family members to speak. Shanann's relatives described shock, betrayal, loss beyond comprehension. Chris Watts received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 for the murders, 1 for unlawful termination of pregnancy, 1 for tampering with a body. He was transferred to a maximum security prison out of state for protection. The case, though legally concluded, continued evolving in public memory. Because unlike many homicides, this one included extensive recorded material, body cam footage, interrogation video, neighbor security camera footage, porch interviews. The contrast between Chris Watts's calm public demeanor and the reality of his actions fueled ongoing analysis. But the courtroom chapter would require deeper examination, because even with confession, motive remained debated. Was it fear of financial collapse? Desire for a new life? Psychological detachment? Or something more complex? After the guilty plea was entered in November 2018, the courtroom atmosphere shifted from uncertainty to consequence. There would be no jury trial, no prolonged cross-examination, no televised legal battle stretching across months. Instead, the focus moved to sentencing and to understanding why. Because confession answers what happened. It does not answer why. Prosecutors explained that the plea agreement removed the death penalty from consideration. Shanann's family had expressed that they did not want years of appeals. They did not want extended public spectacle. They wanted finality. Chris Watts stood in court and admitted to each charge. He answered the judge clearly. Yes. 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 The admissions were procedural, minimal, controlled. The judge asked whether anyone had forced him to plead guilty. He said no. The sentencing hearing that followed allowed family members to speak directly to him. Shanann's mother addressed the court with visible strain. Her voice carried grief and disbelief in equal measure. She described her daughter's love for her children. She described the shock of learning not only that her daughter had died, but that her son-in-law was responsible. Shanann's father spoke quietly. He referenced trust. He referenced the way Chris had been welcomed into their family. His words were not explosive. They were measured, and that restraint amplified their weight. Chris Watts was then sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. The judge described the crimes as incomprehensible. He noted the calculated nature of transporting the bodies. He emphasized that the girls had been placed inside oil tanks deliberately. There was no emotional breakdown in the courtroom from Chris, no visible collapse. His face remained composed. After sentencing, he was transferred first to a Colorado facility, then to a Wisconsin maximum security prison for safety reasons. But the story did not end at sentencing. In February 2019, investigators traveled to the prison to conduct a follow-up interview. They wanted a more detailed time. They wanted to reconcile contradictions between the initial interrogation and the guilty plea. In that interview, Chris elaborated. He described waking early. He described sitting on the edge of the bed next to Shanann. He said he had thought about killing her for weeks. That detail introduced premeditation more explicitly than before. He said he had smothered girls first, believing they were dead. He claimed they had regained consciousness. He described driving with them in the back seat, alive, confused. He said he stopped at the oil site and carried out the killings there. The level of detail was chilling, not because it was loud or emotional, but because it was methodical. He explained sequence, movement, placement. He described Bella asking if the same thing would happen to her that happened to her sister. Investigators noted his tone remained steady. There was no theatrical remorse, no visible collapse. He answered questions as if recounting logistical steps. Psychologists later examined transcripts of that interview. They noted effective flatness. They noted compartmentalization. They discussed the possibility of narcissistic traits, a need to maintain image, a pattern of avoidance rather than confrontation. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Chris had appeared outwardly compliant. Friends described him as quiet, non-confrontational. He rarely argued publicly. But private messages revealed tension. Shanann had confided to friends that he seemed distant, cold. She had sensed withdrawal. He, meanwhile, was pursuing a new relationship. The contrast between his two lives was stark. On one side, a father participating in school events and family photos. On the other, a man texting a coworker about vacations and future plans without children. Financial strain amplified the tension. The Watts family had filed for bankruptcy in 2015, By 2018, debt had accumulated in. Credit cards were near limits. Homeowners association dues had lapsed. A third child would increase financial pressure. Some analysts suggested that Chris viewed family not as bond, but as obstacle, a barrier to starting over. Instead of confronting divorce with legal costs, child support, public embarrassment, he chose elimination. That explanation, however, still feels insufficient, because most people under financial and emotional stress do not commit homicide. The psychological dimension of the case remains layered. Chris Watts did not exhibit a history of violence. No prior arrests for assault, no documented domestic abuse reports. Friends described him as agreeable, helpful. That discrepancy between public normalcy and private violence fueled fascination. The body camera footage from August 13th circulated widely online. In it, Chris stands in his living room as an officer and a neighbor review security footage. The neighbor comments that Chris's behavior appears unusual. Chris shifts his weight, places his hands on his head, rubs his neck. Subtle gestures. Micro-expressions dissected endlessly by viewers. But in real time, those gestures meant little without context. It was the timeline that solidified suspicion. The early departure, the specific oil site, the lack of emotional urgency in his interviews, the affair. Each piece alone might not have convicted. Together, they formed pattern. Even after the plea, debate continued in certain circles. Some questioned whether he acted alone, whether someone influenced him. But there was no evidence of accomplices, no co-conspirator charged. His own statements did not implicate another. The legal record stands singular. Chris Watts killed his pregnant wife and 2 daughters. The case remains a study in dual identity. How someone can maintain routine while planning violence. How calm demeanor does not equate to innocence. How the absence of overt rage can mask calculated intent. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, what lingers is not chaos, it is quiet. The quiet of early morning. The quiet of a truck idling in a driveway. The quiet of a man giving interviews on his front porch hours after committing homicide. The quiet of a courtroom where a guilty plea ends proceedings without spectacle. That quiet is unsettling, because it suggests intention without outward eruption, control without visible fracture. After sentencing, the house in Frederick, Colorado stood empty. The lawn was trimmed, the windows intact. From the outside, it appeared unchanged. Suburban calm remained. But inside, the narrative had fractured permanently. Neighbors who once waved across driveways now spoke to reporters in hushed tones. They described how ordinary the family had seemed. Birthday parties, barbecues, children riding bikes in the cul-de-sac. Nothing had suggested violence. That perception became part of the public fascination, because the Watts case did not follow the stereotype of explosive domestic conflict. There were no prior police reports for assault, no documented restraining orders, no visible history of aggression. Instead, there was silence. And behind that silence, concealment. The oil site at Survey 319 returned to routine operations. Workers resumed daily tasks. The shallow grave was filled, the tanks cleaned. Industrial normalcy resumed. But the location remained etched in collective memory. The idea that children had been placed inside oil tanks was difficult for many to process. It suggested not just homicide, but dehumanization. Chris Watts's prison interviews continued drawing attention. Letters were exchanged with journalists and true crime authors. In some correspondence, he expressed regret. In others, he described religious awakening. He claimed to have found faith, to have accepted responsibility fully. Observers debated sincerity. Some believed his remorse emerged only after capture. Others believed genuine guilt had eventually surfaced. But remorse, even if authentic, does not restore. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, what lingers is not just the violence. It is the ordinariness, the driveway, the porch interview, the work truck, the neighbor's security camera. No dramatic chase, no high-speed pursuit. Just routine behavior intersecting with irreversible choice. If you had watched that porch interview in real time, without knowing what followed, would you have sensed something wrong? Or would calm have reassured you? That tension between appearance and reality is what keeps this case present in discussion years later. Because it challenges assumption that danger looks obvious, that guilt reveals itself loudly, that violence leaves visible warning. In this case, it did not. It moved quietly, in early morning darkness, in a truck backing into a driveway, and ended before sunrise. As the night continues, this story settles not in mystery, but in reflection, on image, on avoidance, on the cost of silence. Thank you for listening.
The disappearance of Robert Durst, the millionaire who wouldn't stay quiet. In January of 1982, a woman vanished from a quiet home in South Salem, New York. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransom demand, no confirmed struggle visible to neighbors. Her name was Kathy Durst. Her husband was Robert Durst. He came from one of New York's wealthiest real estate families. Money was not a problem in that household. Silence would become the problem. Kathy was 29 years old, a medical student, ambitious, independent. Friends later described tension in the marriage, arguments, reports of controlling behavior. On the night she disappeared, January 31st, 1982, she had attended a dinner party with Robert. Witnesses described visible friction between them. At some point during the evening, they left together. That was the last confirmed time she was seen. Robert would later claim that he put her on a train into Manhattan the next morning. He said she wanted to return to her apartment in the city, but there was no confirmed evidence that she boarded a train, no ticket record definitively placing her there, no verified sighting after that night. Her absence was not immediately treated as homicide. Adults sometimes leave, marriages sometimes fracture, but friends grew concerned quickly. Kathy had upcoming exams, responsibilities, a life trajectory that did not align with sudden disappearance. Investigators interviewed Robert. He appeared calm, controlled, measured. He repeated his version consistently. She left. She went to Manhattan. He did not know what happened after. Over time, inconsistencies began surfacing. Statements about timing shifted slightly. Details about phone calls changed, but nothing concrete enough to produce an arrest in 1982. And wealth matters. It does not guarantee innocence, but it does buy time. Legal counsel, controlled narrative, patience. Kathy was declared legally dead years later, but her body was never found. The disappearance remained unresolved. For nearly 2 decades, it sat quietly until another death connected back to the same man. In December 2000, in Los Angeles, a woman named Susan Berman was found shot in her home, execution style, a single bullet to the back of the head. Susan had been a longtime friend of Robert Durst. She had reportedly helped manage media attention around Kathy's disappearance years earlier. The timing of her murder was notable. Los Angeles authorities had reopened inquiry into Kathy's disappearance. Susan was scheduled to speak with investigators. Then she was killed. The connection tightened scrutiny. Durst denied involvement, but the pattern was forming. Missing wife, close friend executed before police interview. Still, no charges were filed against him for those deaths at that time. The story might have remained fragmented if not for a third event. In 2001, in Galveston, police arrested a mute woman named Dorothy Siner. But Dorothy was Robert Durst in disguise. He had been living in a modest apartment under that alias. In that same apartment complex, a neighbor named Morris Black was found dismembered, his body parts placed in garbage bags and scattered into Galveston Bay. Durst admitted to cutting up the body, but he claimed self-defense. He said Morris Black had confronted him, that a struggle ensued, that he panicked, and that the dismemberment was fear-driven, not murderous. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the unsettling pattern becomes clearer. A wife disappears, a friend is shot, a neighbor is dismembered, and in each instance, Robert Durst stands at the center. Yet in 2003, he was acquitted of murder in Texas. The jury accepted the self-defense argument. The admission of dismemberment did not produce a conviction. The man who admitted cutting up a body walked free. The pattern did not disappear, it deepened. Durst returned to New York, continued living under public suspicion, but not conviction. Then came the documentary. In 2015, HBO aired The Jinx, a series examining Durst's life and the suspicious deaths surrounding him. Filmmakers interviewed him extensively. He appeared composed, even amused at times. But during filming, after what he believed was the end of an interview, he entered a bathroom still wearing a live microphone. He muttered words that would echo worldwide. "They're all dead, of course." The audio was debated, interpreted, parsed, but its impact was immediate. The timing of his arrest was equally striking. On the eve of the documentary's final episode airing, authorities arrested Robert Durst in New Orleans. He was later extradited to face charges related to Susan Berman's murder in Los Angeles. After decades of evasion, the legal pressure finally crystallized. But rewind to 1982, to South Salem, to a young medical student who vanished. The story does not begin with a confession. It begins with absence, a husband's calm demeanor, a family's wealth, a missing woman, and silence stretching across decades. After the 1982 disappearance of Kathy Durst in South Salem, investigators struggled with absence. No body, no crime scene, no clear forensic anchor. But absence does not erase suspicion. Friends of Kathy later described a marriage marked by volatility, arguments, reports of physical altercations, claims that she had once sought medical treatment for injuries allegedly inflicted by her husband. None of those claims alone produced criminal charges at the time, and Robert Durst's family resources allowed for controlled legal navigation. Over the next 18 years, the case remained technically open but inactive. Kathy was eventually declared legally dead in 2017, decades after her disappearance. But long before that declaration, another death reactivated scrutiny. In December 2000, in Los Angeles, a woman named Susan Berman was found shot in her home, execution style, a single bullet to the back of the head. Susan had been a longtime friend of Robert Durst. She had reportedly helped manage media attention around Kathy's disappearance years earlier. The timing of her murder was notable. Los Angeles authorities had reopened inquiry into Kathy's disappearance. Susan was scheduled to speak with investigators. Then she was killed.
When New York investigators reopened aspects of the 1982 case in 2000, Susan was reportedly scheduled to speak with them. Then she was killed. Los Angeles police suspected a targeted execution. A handwritten note had been mailed to police shortly before the body was discovered, containing Berman's address. The note's handwriting would later become a key piece of forensic evidence. Investigators eventually compared that note to a letter Durst had written years earlier. The similarities became central to prosecution decades later. At the time of Berman's death, however, Durst was not immediately charged. He denied involvement. He maintained distance from the crime scene, but the pattern, disappearance of spouse, execution of close friend, tightened around him. Then came Texas. In 2001, Durst moved to Galveston under the alias Dorothy Siner. He disguised himself as a woman, paid rent in cash, avoided close relationships. His neighbor in the apartment complex was Morris Black. In September 2001, Black vanished. Days later, body parts were discovered floating in Galveston Bay. The torso was found first, then additional remains in trash bags. The head was never recovered. Durst was arrested. He admitted to shooting Morris Black. He admitted to dismembering the body, but he claimed self-defense. He said Black had discovered his true identity and confronted him, that a struggle ensued over a gun, that the firearm discharged accidentally, and that panic led him to cut up the body. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the emotional center shifts from shock to pattern recognition. A missing wife, a close friend executed, a neighbor dismembered. In each case, Robert Durst is present. But in 2003, a Texas jury acquitted him of murder. The defense emphasized lack of premeditation evidence, focused on self-defense, argued that dismemberment, though grotesque, did not prove initial intent to kill. He walked free. The acquittal stunned observers. The man who admitted cutting up a body avoided prison for murder. He was later convicted only of bail jumping related to the case. He served minimal time. Then he returned to relative obscurity. But the cases never fully dissipated. Investigators in New York continued reviewing Kathy's disappearance. Los Angeles detectives preserved evidence in the Berman case. Handwriting analysis matured. DNA testing advanced. Time, in some cases, strengthens forensic capability rather than weakens it. Then came the documentary. The Jinx aired in 2015. Filmmakers had spent years interviewing Durst. He participated willingly, perhaps believing he could outmaneuver narrative. During the final episode, footage captured him entering a bathroom after an interview, still wearing a live microphone. He muttered phrases interpreted as confession. "They're all dead, of course. What the hell did I do? Kill them all, of course." Durst later claimed he was speaking hypothetically, but the audio reignited law enforcement urgency. On March 14, 2015, he was arrested in New Orleans. This time, charges centered on the 2000 murder of Susan Berman. The trial moved to trial years later. Handwriting analysis linked him to the note mailed to police. Circumstantial evidence connected motive to preventing her from speaking with investigators. In 2021, he was convicted of Berman's murder in Los Angeles. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in custody in 2022. But rewind again to 1982, because the center of the pattern remains Kathy. Her body has never been found. No definitive crime scene has been located. No murder conviction was obtained for her disappearance. The legal resolution came through the Berman case, but the emotional origin rests in South Salem. A young woman pursuing medical education, a marriage strained, a husband with wealth and composure, and a disappearance that began everything. For decades, Robert Durst existed in a strange space between suspicion and consequence. The pattern surrounding him was undeniable. a missing wife in South Salem, a close friend executed in Los Angeles, a neighbor dismembered in Galveston. But patterns do not automatically translate to convictions. Durst's family wealth insulated him early. The Durst Organization was one of New York's most powerful real estate empires. Money does not erase evidence, but it shapes timelines. It buys attorneys capable of dismantling prosecution narratives. It funds private investigators. It allows controlled communication with media. In 1982, when Kathy vanished, investigative technology was limited. No cell phone records, no widespread surveillance cameras, no digital footprints. The absence of a body complicated prosecution. Without a confirmed crime scene, suspicion floats without anchor. Friends described Kathy as fearful at times. They reported that she had once told them she feared for her safety. But fear reported to friends is not the same as sworn testimony, and once she was gone, her voice disappeared with her. Durst maintained calm publicly. He did not display overt panic. He did not flee immediately. He allowed the disappearance to settle into ambiguity. That composure became part of his image, controlled, detached, measured. In the Berman case, motive sharpened. Susan Berman had served as a kind of informal spokesperson years earlier. When renewed scrutiny into Kathy's disappearance surfaced in 2000, Susan was positioned to speak. Her execution-style killing suggested silencing. The handwritten note mailed to police with her address was crucial. Handwriting analysts later testified that the cadaver note matched Durst's writing. Misspellings aligned, letter formations aligned. It became one of the strongest physical anchors in the decades-long saga. But even then, it took years to assemble prosecutable structure. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the unsettling element is patience. Not impulsive rage, but patient survival.
Durst did not unravel quickly. He adjusted identities, moved states, adopted disguises. In Texas, he lived as a woman under an alias, paid rent in cash, maintained low profile. The dismemberment of Morris Black was brutal, but even that did not end his freedom immediately. In court, his defense reframed the narrative. They emphasized lack of direct proof of premeditation. They argued panic. They leaned into the idea that shocking behavior after death does not prove intent before it. The jury agreed, acquittal. That moment reinforced a public perception he could evade consequence. But evasion requires vigilance, and vigilance eventually fatigues. The documentary The Jinx altered the landscape, not because it introduced new forensic evidence immediately, but because it reshaped public awareness. It forced long-ignored patterns into mainstream attention. Durst's decision to participate remains psychologically intriguing. Why agree to extended interviews about unresolved murders? Confidence? Narcissism? Belief in intellectual superiority? Perhaps he believed narrative control remained possible. The bathroom microphone moment became cultural shorthand. A man alone, muttering into what he thought was privacy, interpreted by millions. Whether the statement constituted direct confession legally was debated, but its psychological impact was enormous. Within hours of the final episode airing, law enforcement arrested him. The timing reinforced the sense of long-awaited consequence. At trial in Los Angeles for Susan Berman's murder, prosecutors laid out the arc carefully. Motive: prevent testimony that could harm him in the reopened Kathy investigation. Means: access and connection. Evidence: handwriting, witness accounts, timeline consistency. After decades of ambiguity, the structure solidified. He was convicted in 2021, sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in custody in early 2022. Legally, that closed one chapter, but it did not close the original one. Kathy Durst disappeared in 1982 from South Salem. Her body has never been recovered. No murder conviction was ever secured in connection with her disappearance. The pattern begins with her and ends without formal resolution for her case. That unresolved origin gives the story its weight, because the trajectory of the next 40 years flows outward from that first absence. Late at night, when this story is told slowly, the unsettling element is not only violence, it is insulation. For decades, Durst existed inside a space shaped by wealth and legal precision. Money did not erase evidence, but it slowed it. It provided layers between suspicion and consequence. He moved states, adopted aliases, survived trial, maintained composure. In the Texas case, he admitted to dismembering a body and was acquitted of murder. That verdict reinforced public perception that he could survive anything. But legal systems move unevenly, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. The handwritten cadaver note in the Berman case became the hinge. Misspellings consistent with his earlier writing, structure consistent. The decision to mail her address to police became self-incriminating evidence decades later. And then there was the microphone moment, the bathroom, the muttered words. Whether interpreted as confession or fragmented thought, it shifted momentum. Public attention intensified, prosecutors accelerated, and the arc bent toward conviction. But remove the documentary, remove the microphone, and the pattern remains. A wife disappears, a confidant is executed, a neighbor is dismembered. In each case, proximity aligns with Durst. The narrative is less about sudden eruption and more about endurance. How long can ambiguity survive without anchor? How long can suspicion remain circumstantial before hardening into proof? The Durst story became a cultural study in privilege, patience, and forensic evolution. In 1982, digital trails were rare. By 2021, handwriting analysis, timeline reconstruction, and long-preserved evidence created a cumulative structure strong enough to convict. Time does not always weaken cases. Sometimes it refines them. For the families connected to these deaths, resolution is uneven. Susan Berman's case reached verdict. Morris Black's death resulted in acquittal. Kathy Durst's disappearance remains unresolved legally, though widely believed by investigators to have been homicide. The wooded property in South Salem remains. The apartment complex in Galveston still stands. The Los Angeles home where Berman was killed exists within ordinary city rhythm. But those spaces carry memory, not visibly, but historically. When the lights go out and houses settle into silence, the Robert Durst case lingers because it challenges a simple expectation: that wealth guarantees safety, that silence protects indefinitely, that time erases suspicion. It does not. It delays, and sometimes delay stretches across decades. But eventually, patterns surface, even if they do not close every chapter. Thank you for listening.